My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the programming coordinator for the Osterville Village Library. Thank you so much for being here today. And to our friends on Zoom, thank you so much for joining us. We are excited to kick off Women's History Month with a bang, or canon. Women have been called many things throughout history: mother, aunt, daughter, grandmother, pirate. Join us as we welcome Jessica Sheppard, pirate expert, and let's explore the history of women pirates.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. Can you guys hear me from the back, or do I need to shout a bit more? We're good. All right, I get a thumbs up. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk about this. I'm going to try and keep this as close to an hour as I can, but feel free to wiggle, get up. There will be a point where you'll notice it's kind of a halfway point, so if you do need to shift or move, by all means do so. I can become long-winded, so let me know. Amy, at some point, wherever you are, wiggle and let me know my timing, since I don't have a clock up here.
Absolutely not. You're good.
You're stuck here. You're gonna be here for the whole month of March then. So, let's get going.
Yeah.
Got it. Oh, you, there we go. All right, to put us all on even playing field, we're gonna start off with a couple of definitions, unfortunately. We're gonna have a clarification here between a pirate and a privateer. So first off, a privateer is going to be somebody that is licensed or sanctioned. This is somebody that is given official paperwork, a letter of marque by a monarch. And it would have been an individual that had owned their own vessel and had a crew, where the monarch would then hire that person because it was cost effective to have them operating on behalf of the monarchy to destroy and pillage and become a nuisance to their enemies. That privateer would be allowed to keep 90% of what they pillage, but give a 10% kickback to the monarch. It's very enticing. A lot of privateers ended up saying, why am I kicking back 10%? Why not go completely and turn pirate? A pirate, therefore, is somebody that has no country designation. It was somebody that was free for all. Anything was available for the taking. And they had no loyalty to a particular individual or a company or a religion or a monarch. So they were out there attacking anybody and everything. 100% went back to the crew, and then that was divided amongst each other. If you were a privateer, you were hired. If you were a pirate, people would turn pirate in different circumstances. If you were a vessel that was under attack, a lot of times people were forced into piracy, which is called conscripting, taken against your will. Some people volunteered to turn pirate. This sounded like a great opportunity. They were looking for adventure or travel, financial gains. They were trying to avoid getting arrested. Quick, they'll jump on a boat and turn pirate. They were shanghaied. They were being kidnapped and taken. A lot of times when they were passed out and you needed to fill a crew quota, they would take that person and they would wake up the next morning on a boat. Surprise, you're now a pirate. So there's a distinction between those two. And then number two, for all of us to kind of start on an even playing field, we need to think about these characteristics of a pirate. So in your mind, individually, picture pirate, not who, but what. The adjectives that would describe in your mind a pirate.
Johnny Depp.
But besides that, any characteristics that anybody would like to add to this idea?
Toothless.
Toothless? Adventurous?
Yeah.
Somebody with a hook?
Ruthless.
Ruthless, there we go.
No family.
No family.
Swashbuckler.
A swashbuckler.
Earrings.
Earrings. So we have a lot of physical characteristics. We're looking at somebody that's murderous. They probably are stinky and smelly and, they're probably drunk, they're uneducated. A lot of times I bet all of you maybe are thinking Caucasian, male. Let's keep these ideas in our mind as we go through this talk a little bit
I
here
think
today.
Gina Davis.
Gina Davis, there we go. All right, so let's start off here thinking a little bit about women in particular. Women throughout history have been associated with men. And that being said, you need to think about this in the context that women have always been linked to a man. They're not isolated throughout time. Initially, if you look at the upper and lower classes, upper class women were always under the protection and the responsibility of their father or a ward until they were married. Then they were passed on to their husband, and financially and legally they were responsible for that woman. If that husband passed away and she became widowed, she was then shuffled on to her eldest son. So she was always considered a burden. This is a woman that was going to have to be taken care of. Women weren't given a full education, they weren't expected to work, and therefore they had to be taken care of. When they were having children, if they had a daughter, great, they had a daughter, another mouth to feed. They had another daughter, great. I think about Henry. He had how many wives until somebody produced an heir to carry on the male lineage. So their entire purpose was to marry well so that dad didn't have to financially care for her. In the lower ends of society, women were expected to do the cooking and the cleaning and the child caring and taking care of the household and taking care of the animals and taking care of the people that are sick. You're creating a society where women are either a nuisance or underappreciated, or they're feeling completely overwhelmed. This is a very disgruntled section of society. So their concepts definitely were considered in a negative tone. They are not really the wanted section of society. When we think about women using a rebellious side of themselves, if they didn't fit these stereotypes of a woman that was following these rules and being domesticated and following their husband's rules, if they were speaking their minds, if they were interested in politics, if they showed a propensity for numbers and finance, if they were capable of doing the same thing of a man or doing something better than a man, that was a threat. That showed that she had ability, that she could be considered an equal to a man. And so this was something that was absolutely poo-pooed or dismissed. When we look throughout history, history is traditionally written by white Christian men. And so the records of strong, independent women are oftentimes altered, or that history about this woman has been changed to the point where her storyline becomes more of a lesson learner. Don't be like her. And so what we end up having, rather than a documentation of what this woman did, it becomes a documentation of what this woman did that was offensive. And her story, rather than recognizing her accolades, focuses more on her beauty or her devotion to God, or her taking care of her parents her entire life, or becoming repentful for the deeds that she did do. Maybe we acknowledge that she was a rebellious woman, but then she changes her ways and she falls right back into that sex stereotype. And so you end up having character arcs that you will see throughout history. And we see it continuously. Up here, I've put up a couple examples. What you see on the very far side over here is from the Pirates of the Caribbean, because we're talking pirates. The character that you see there is Elizabeth Swann. And so she starts off as the governor's daughter and she's prim and proper, but then she goes throughout the several movies, wild, adventurous, becomes a pirate queen. But then in the final movie, she becomes wed, she's back on land, she's back in the corsets and the dresses, and she has children. Kind of a mixed message that you're giving everybody. Eowyn, the second picture that you see here from The Lord of the Rings, the same thing. She is the devout daughter to the uncle, and she stands by him and she nursemaids him. And then she has this wild rebellious period where she dons armor, goes into the battles, and as soon as the battles are done, wipes her hands of it, puts back on her garments, and stays back at the house as a princess. Ruth from the Pirates of Penzance, the same thing, and absolutely, completely PC wrong these days. The Swiss Family Robinson books, if you go back and watch this movie, Birdie, the character of the girl, quote unquote, that is discovered on the shoreline dressed as a boy. When the two brothers that are adventuring around the island encounter and save this boy from the pirates, they force him to travel around the island. Come on, keep up, come on, keep up. And then discover that Birdie is actually Beatrice. And immediately, oh, can I help you? Oh, hold my hand. And she changes her voice tone. Oh, thank you. Oh, my goodness. And suddenly she has wings that can't possibly go anywhere. And she wears pink chiffon. Complete character arcs right there for you. But we have always recognized strong, powerful women. We have had these faces throughout our lifetime that we recognize. Sojourner Truth up on the top was a Black woman that fought for land ownership and slavery rights. Betty Friedan was the beginning woman for our current ideas of feminism and women's rights. And then Jane Fonda continued that in the second wave of feminism for us. Ruth Bader Ginsburg fought tooth and nail for women's rights for voting and personal body rights. And recently, recognizable faces for the ideas of speaking your mind about what's going on globally and being involved in politics. Greta Thunberg and Malala Yousafzai is the youngest Nobel laureate to have earned a Nobel Prize for promoting women's education, being able to even go to school in Pakistan. So what's amazing is that these women have always been here. They've just been stifled or ignored or underwritten. But when we go to archaeological sites, when we're doing more research, if you look between the lines of newspaper articles and history and genealogies, you'll see that women of power and liberalism have been there all along. And we're finding more and more evidence, even in the DNA these days. At sites, we're recognizing now that 40% of the bones that we excavate from battle sites are female. So they were even there, and rightfully so. Why wouldn't you want to be there helping to defend your farmland and your family and your children? So it's an interesting change to the idea of where women stand in history. So if we think particularly to pirates and the idea of the start of feminism, I reintroduce you to some of these powerful ladies. So the first one here is Hatshepsut, and she was one of the very first pharaohs of Egypt. She was not a queen, she was a pharaoh. And when we discover her hieroglyphics, she had herself represented as a man to legitimize her power. All of her effigies have her in the skirt with a broad shoulder and exposed chest, and she's donned a beard. And so that symbol of power made her recognized as the pharaoh himself. And she ruled for 20 years and was leading a lot of the battles herself to increase the territory of Egypt, to make the Lower Nile a larger stronghold, and increase the trade routes throughout that area. An amazing woman. Everybody is pretty much familiar with the idea of Joan of Arc, the Maid of New Orleans. This was a peasant woman who dared to actually directly talk with God, which was a man's job, a man's ability. And she donned military armor to gain the presence of the Pope to be able to explain her vision. And in doing that, she was convincing enough to explain how sections and battles throughout France were going to be won. That strategically ended up placing in the 100 Years' War critical battles that inevitably put Charles VII in charge. So it changed the course of history based on this one woman's vision. The lower monarchs and the barons of France that lost in this process were very upset when they realized that the winnings occurred because of a woman. They were absolutely aghast. They had her arrested. She was brought into Paris and she was burnt at the stake. And we all understand that she was burnt because she was a heretic and she was a witch. But if you actually look at the documentation of what her true charge was, she was burnt at the stake because she was wearing male garb and impersonating a male. She was an absolute threat to the idea of male power, male ability. So she was an amazing woman herself. This is Margaret Ann Bulkley. This is an actual picture of her. I love this story right here because this is a power woman that dared to actually become a doctor. And remember, the idea of medicine at this time was simply for men. If you had the job of a doctor, that means that you were going to be exposed to naked bodies. Seeing gore and blood, that you were going to be exposed to death, which was a delicate subject, and women, of course, are prone to fainting and irrationals, so this is not for them. You had to have intelligence to study medication. So Margaret herself ended up becoming a doctor. She went as the name of James Barry her entire life, and she actually was a decorated British Army surgeon. She was very well known, very respected, and was only discovered to be a woman on her deathbed when they were changing her body and getting ready for the burial. They were shocked. Charlotte Parkhurst went by the name of Charlie. Now this woman, I think, would fit those stereotypes that you're thinking in your mind about pirates. This was an adventurous woman that went from New Hampshire all the way out to California, hitchhiking by herself, alone, unchaperoned, adventurous woman. And she traveled across the country, picking up odd jobs here and there. She was dressed as a man for safety reasons. And one of the jobs that she picked up and held for several years was a dangerous job driving the 6-horse stagecoach. And this is the picture that's taken from the penny papers of the time. And Charlie was an absolute land pirate. This woman was short in stature, but feisty. And she was driving through the dangerous Indian territory and had ended up getting in a shootout battle and lost an eye, literally had an eye patch. But she was also a wild woman that would smoke cigars and chew tobacco, and she would gamble and drink whiskey. So I think she would count as a feminist hybrid right here. Frances Clayton, again, these are actual photographs during the Civil War time period. Frances Clayton was a woman that was considered ungangly, and she was tall, quote unquote, unattractive, and she was aggressive. And she and her husband were very politically active and decided to join the army. And she fit in quite comfortably in the role of a man. And throughout the battles would gamble and play cards and drink, and was aggressive on the battlefield. When her husband was killed in battle, she stepped over his body and continued to battle for several more encounters until they discovered that she was a woman. She was then forcibly removed from the army and forced to go out on tour as an apology circuit to explain what she did and why it was so wrong to impersonate a man. And so she was publicly humiliated the rest of her life to avoid jail time. A threat, if not, to the ideas of what a woman was supposed to be during the time period. And an interesting newspaper article written in the LA Times describes Margaret Mary from Mexico. She was Mexico's petticoat pirate. And again, this is kind of depicted in the ideas of this gentleman of how this dazzling, beautiful, wonderful, petite little delicate woman became a savage. And she came from a wealthy family and had political aspirations to change what was happening to her community. And she ends up gathering over 700 local women, and they start a march to the Capitol. And in that process, they start to loot and burn and pillage and destroy the minor villages. And Margaret's all excited about this. She's like, this is gaining in momentum. And as they get closer and closer to the Capitol, they become kind of enfrenzied in what they're doing. And she says, save President Diaz for me. I would like to decapitate him myself. Violent woman. But these gender stereotypes continue in different formats as well. If we look at the sex stereotypes and discriminations that occur, you can look at these in literature. Both of these books were released under pseudonyms to have the works stand alone and independently, not to be judged as a woman author. Charlotte Bronte went as Courier Bell, Joanna Rowling went as J.K., So we see a lot of discrimination even today. We can see it live and in person on television, which is ridiculous. It still occurs. The picture that you have here on the left is from Catherine Switzer, who was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon. She, in 1967, signed up and she got a bib penny number because she registered as K Switzer. There was no designation saying that women cannot run this race, but it was assumed that men only would be in this sport. So when she showed up and started running, and the other people noticed that she was a woman, she was physically pushed to the ground and trampled during this running for being a woman. The other picture on the side you see here is Serena Williams. And she, again, being an athlete, has no designation anywhere written that a woman's attire has to include a skirt to play tennis. When she showed up at the US Open in her fashion outfit, promoting her own line of fashion, she was immediately banned from the US Open for the rest of that year. That's changed since then. So let's focus on pirates. We know that these women have been oppressed. We know that there's been a history and a following of this idea of quelling women's ability and hiding these things. But let's think about pirates for a moment. And I apologize, I am going to read this quote. I hate when people do that, but this is so well worth it. It says here, their lives were a continual alteration between idleness and extreme toil, riotous debauchery and great privation, prolonged monotony and days of great excitement and adventure. At one moment, they were reveling in unlimited rum and gambling for handfuls of gold and diamonds. At another, half starving for food and reduced to a pint of water a day under a tropical sun. Yet the attractions of this life were so great that men of good position took to piracy. The idea of being a pirate has an allure, but you have to understand that being out at sea is a completely different place. This is a separate location. Might is right out at the sea. And even today, we have separate laws persecuting maritime law and issues that occur out at sea. And for a woman to decide to turn pirate is quite a decision. First off, women on vessels were considered bad luck. If she opted to be on this vessel, she was going to be persecuted because they caused trouble. Everybody's going to be fighting over her. You know, there's a lot of sexual tension potentially. There's violence. If there's going to be violence, she's going to need to meet that violence with violence. There's nowhere for her to run. There's no one that she's going to call for help for. She's going to have to be aggressive or more aggressive than the men to survive in this condition. They're considered bad luck to be on the boat, so they would be thrown overboard. Even if they weren't fought over, they would just simply say, we don't even want her to be here. If she decided to stay on the boat, these would be unholy places for a woman to be. She's going to see hot, sweaty bodies in the tropics where these guys are going to peel off their shirts and have half-naked bodies. There's going to be fighting. There's going to be blood and guts and gore. Men are going to be relieving themselves on the side of the boat. These are conditions not fit for a woman to be around. There's vulgarity and swearing. And then, of course, if you choose to stay, you have to hide the fact that you are a woman. You're going to have to bind your breasts. You're going to have to alter the way that you walk, the sway of your hips. You're going to have to change the shapeliness of your body in other ways. You're gonna have to cut your hair. You're gonna have to deepen your voice. You're going to have to hide your menses. And so to choose to turn pirate was a very severe choice for a woman to do. And yet many of them did, which is quite amazing. So why would they want to be a pirate? Why would you choose to go through all of these hardships? If we look at these two pictures, there's a reason potentially. Now, in your mind, when you were thinking pirate, you probably were thinking that quintessential pirate, Johnny Depp, someone said. That is going to be the pirate of time period from the golden age of piracy. This is 1675 to 1725. It's the Baroque period. So we have everything gilded. We're all listening to mandolins and Mozart is quite popular at this point. Everything is on the violin. And the fashion and the time period for an upper class individual would look something like this. And if we look at this quintessential woman of this time period, you can see characteristics and qualities that are befitting of a woman. The stereotype sex role that a woman would be fit for. So in this picture, what I am noticing, and if there's anything else that you see, please call out. I'm seeing a demure stance. You have a woman that is bound in corset, bound in hairdo, bound by being inside the household, looking down passively, feeding domesticated pigeons, holding china, fair of face. You know, she would be arranging flowers, learning languages, playing musical instruments, right? This is someone that is completely isolated. This is somebody that is restricted in every possible way. If we put that in juxtaposition, what do we notice in this picture?
Freedom.
Freedom.
She's still wearing a corset.
She's still in a corset. Her hair's loose. She's out of doors. There's stormy weather behind her. She's wearing pants. Her legs are spread open. She is with a man outside. You know, she's in condition. She's holding weapons. You know, there's a lot of difference, and you can see the attraction to the idea of pirates, right? If you don't want to be forced into a marriage, if you don't want to have to be under the direction of the priests and your parents and your eldest son, if you want to be a rebellious woman, you might choose to turn pirate. If you are found pregnant out of wedlock, to avoid the idea of being kicked out and thrown from your family, being on the streets and dealing with poverty, which leads to death or prostitution or the convent, piracy could be a wonderful option for you. Something where you could avoid jail time, you could avoid being in the convent, you could get away from those families, get away from a forced marriage, and have the fate of your life in your own hands. So there is the allure to that.
Does she accept motherhood?
Does she accept motherhood? The answer to that is no. There's a couple of women that we'll talk about. But that was also considered a burden. So let's dive into these ladies, in particular pirates. Everybody doing okay? Anybody need to wiggle? Okay, this is the fun part. I reintroduce you to the most powerful lady here, the very first documented pirate in written format, where her name is associated with the term of piracy, Alwilda. Alwilda, from the roughly 5th century, is a Danish princess. Now keep in mind that this is going to be a character arc story princess that turns pirate and lives happily ever after. But she is a pirate nonetheless. And if any of you are lucky enough to make it down to the New Bedford Whaling Museum to see their scrimshaw exhibit that was just recently at the Cahoon Museum, they're coming here. I hope that they bring, they have a, it's about a 6-inch, 8-inch sperm whale tooth that is scrimshawed with this effigy of Alwilda. It's fantastic, the whole exhibit. I digress. Alwilda is a Dutch princess. And the story and the myth and the legend of this pirate woman is that she was put up in a tower guarded by 2 snakes, and her father says that whoever can best these snakes can win my daughter's hand in marriage. Several men fail until Prince Alf does it, and he storms up to the top of the tower, and she goes, not interested. And so she decides to escape with her handmaidens down to the docks, where conveniently there is a pirate vessel with drunken sailors that have just lost their captain, waiting for a new captain to show up. They see her, and she's so beautiful, she must be able to be a captain. They elect her the captain, and she becomes the scourge of the Baltic Seas. And so throughout the area in the fjords for several years, she becomes this pillaging pirate of an individual, but nobody's quite sure who it is. And so the other Scandinavian kings say, you need to get out there, you need to destroy this person. And inevitably Prince Alf tracks her down, and they recognize each other. And she goes, oh, wait, you've changed. And he goes, you're so powerful and I respect your power now. And she goes, okay, I guess we can get married. I'll stop pirating. They have children and live happily ever after. But she's considered a pirate. We have to start somewhere. I give you the next lovely lady. This is Lagatha. Historically, we do know that shield maidens exist in Viking history. Powerful women that were part of battles. They were adept at weaponry, weapon craft, as well as farming and leadership in roles of power throughout the Viking territories. We don't know specifically all of the details of Lagatha. Her myth kind of is entwined with bits and pieces of history. However, if anybody has watched the TV series on the History Channel Vikings, her particular depiction is very, very accurate. This is her character here, Lagatha. The story of this woman is that King Fro from Sweden has invaded Norway. And in doing so, he overtakes the area, enforces all of the women and children into brothels and jail, and kills the king to take over the territory. Lagatha is one of those women put into the brothels. She's not happy about it. She tries to escape. She's trying to rally everybody. She can't escape. The nephew of the deposed king, Ragnar Lothbrok, comes and wants to avenge his uncle. And in doing so, he frees the women, doubles the size of his army. The women, very disgruntled, now freed, take up arms and start kicking butt. Lagatha being one of the most powerful. And she is reputed to be super good at wielding an axe. And Ragnar looks over and goes, wow. Look at her hair flowing. Look at that axe movement. Hubba, hubba, hubba. And so once she gets her revenge, she goes back to her farmhouse and wants nothing to do with anything else. She wants to live a simple life. Ragnar follows her and she's like, no, 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 no. And so she protects her house with a bear and a dog. And once again, Ragnar shows his power by taking down these two protectors, and then he woos her and she says, okay, fine, we'll get married as equals. They rule the area for a little while until he gets bored with her and he goes off, remarries and has an adventure. She says, all right, well, if you can do it, I can do it too. She marries another king, but is still in love with Ragnar. And when he, off on his adventures, suddenly is in need, sends word to Lagatha, help, help, help. What's she gonna do? So she vessels. And so this amazing sailor, adventurous woman leads that battle over to him, rescues his bud, and then comes back home. She's going to live a simple life. Well, while she's gone, she finds out that her husband, second husband, has been cheating on her. At this point, the lady's had enough. And so while they're in bed together one night, she stabs him in the eye, not the heart. And so she decides from that point on, she's not going to remarry. She's just going to rule on her own for the rest of her life. Powerful, aggressive, sailor, adventurous, feminist. I would dare say a pirate. Fantastic woman, for those of you that are looking for a little history to look into on the month of March. Sayyida al-Hara is the last Islamic leader that ever existed. This woman was phenomenal. And if you're not familiar with her, she was a wealthy family member that was kicked out of Spain during the time of Ferdinand and Isabella. This is the Spanish Inquisition. They are ridding the Iberian Peninsula of Muslims. And so she gets forced back with her family as a young girl to live along the Moroccan coastline. So up here you can see Morocco, Spain is just up here. This is the Straits of Gibraltar on the top. And they set up household. She is educated. She learns multiple languages, astronomy, agriculture, and she marries well into the local governor. They are given permission to build a new city in this area, and she helps with the architecture and the design. And she ends up building the city of Teotihuacan. Probably said that wrong, but it looks something like this. And even today, for those of you that decide to travel, this is a World UNESCO Heritage Site. It's one of the most beautiful cities along the northern African coast. And he passes away. She ends up taking over the position as governor. Now, this particular location on that area is a critical stronghold. Because when you think about that area, it's juxtaposed to the Saharan desert. And so to protect her lands and her people, this is like the fertile strip of land, and it's a seaport. And a woman in a powerful position, we should just marry her and then take over her territory. And she's like, no, I can do this on my own, this is fine. And so with her intelligence, she forms a partnership with the corsairs in the area and financially hires the Barbary pirates. And she says, I need to protect my people. And so she ends up creating a relationship with these particular individuals to patrol the Mediterranean on her behalf while she is still the leader. And it's so productive a relationship that she becomes known as the Mediterranean pirate queen. The Barbary pirates, for those of us that aren't familiar with them, were the scourge of the area. People would pay at today's rate about $2 million a year as protection. We'll pay you off so that you don't attack our boats and our vessels. So they were very notoriously brutal. If anybody is part of the Marine Corps, you know the battle hymn from the shores of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Those are the Tripoli pirates that we're talking about. Even in the United States, up until Thomas Jefferson in 1826, we were paying off the Barbary pirates so that the US could trade throughout Europe. So she was quite powerful, quite amazing. When she decides to marry, it's on her terms. The Sultan of Morocco says, wow, you really have it going on. This is prime real estate. We should get together. And she finally says, fine, but you have to come to me, which forces him to travel. And it takes him about a week to get to her city of Tetuan. They have a marriage ceremony and she goes, great, you can leave now. We'll keep our titles, but you can rule from there and I'll rule here solo. Thanks for everything. And they do for the next 30 years. Pretty cool. You can't talk pirates without Grace O'Malley. This is the larger than life woman from Ireland, Grace O'Malley. This woman was born on a boat. I mean, she's Paul Bunyan legend kind of thing. She comes from a sailing family. She's from County Cork. And she would grow up wild and unruly as the only child, her dad's favorite. She would climb the rigging of the boat and moon people. Took it upon herself at one point to rid the nuisance of all of the sheep being attacked in the village. And so she climbed the cliffs up to an eagle's nest, and she was going to kill the bald eagle that was stealing all of the sheep. And in the process, she ends up getting a scar, so she's permanently scarred across her face her whole life, disfigured from a battle with that bald eagle. Her dad was a merchant, and during this time period, the English are trying to take over Ireland, like always, right? And they're being stopped at all times and taxed and questioned, and where are your papers? One time, there is a British police officer, basically, that stops her dad's boat, and Grace is up in the rigging, and it starts to become a confrontation. And it looks like her dad is about to get hurt, and Grace drops down from the rigging onto the police officer and stabs this guy to death to protect her dad. She's a pretty crazy lady. She ends up getting married, and when she moves out of town to a different section of Ireland, her husband's stronghold is under attack as well. And in the process of defending this new homeland for herself, she opts to melt the roof off of her castle, the lead roofing, and pour it over the invading English people. They lose the battle, but that devotion to her people and the loyalty of her crew is so strong that when Grace has to escape back down to County Cork, they go with her. And she returns to pirating and exploiting the area. But when the new regent is put into town, he doesn't acknowledge that Grace is in charge of her section of Ireland. She's a woman. She can't be a landowner. This is ridiculous. And so he starts to really berate and particularly harass Grace. Arrests her two sons, murders one of her sons, overtaxes her. And Grace at this point is like, all right, I've had enough. And she goes straight to Queen Elizabeth and lodges a complaint. Now, Queen Elizabeth is being barraged by a whole bunch of people, and in order to make sure that there's not cranks coming in and trying to talk to her, she sends out kind of a filter flyer. Grace is able to fill in the questionnaire. She speaks Latin, French, Gaelic, and English, and she can read and write. She's an educated woman. And so she's intrigued. Queen Elizabeth is intrigued and says, send this woman to me. And we know that Grace, now in her mid-50s, has an audience with Queen Elizabeth for 2 days behind closed doors. It would be an amazing, amazing opportunity to find out what these two women were talking about. You think about both of them as females in powers of male role positions, leaders for their people, women, unmarried, both of them, and having to have these strifes and constant barrages and marriage proposals and dismissiveness. Their conversation must have been fantastic. What comes out of this is that Grace leaves with a full pardon. She becomes a commissioned privateer for the Queen. She is known as a sea dog or a hellhound at this point. She's allowed to pirate the rest of her life. The regent that was giving her problems has to pay her back for murdering her son. Her other son gets kicked out of jail. He has to pay her 1 year's salary as repatriation, and he gets deported back to England. She's pretty good at negotiations. And those of us that think pirate, we always think Mary Read and Anne Bonny. But do we know their true stories? We know their names, but we don't really know them. So I'd like to introduce you to the complex story. There's going to be 2 ladies and 2 men, 4 pirates altogether. Bear with me on this one. This is an amazing story because this is drama. This is scandal. You know, this is the Inquirer of the time period. Everybody wanted to know what was going on. So if we start off with Mary Read. Mary Read is from England. Her parents were married. They had a little boy. And right after that, they got pregnant again with Mary. But dad decides, I don't really want to be a dad, and he abandons the wife. Now, according to society, you have a woman pregnant and no husband. This is against those gender stereotypes. She has to flee to the countryside. She's embarrassed in society. And while she is in the countryside, the little boy dies. But she gives birth to the new baby. That's Mary. The mom, trying to make ends meet, is now in desperate poverty, is resorting to prostitution, and conditions are horrible, horrible, horrible. She decides to pass this new baby off as that little boy, dresses Mary as a boy, calls him Mark, and goes to her mother-in-law and says, you should support your grandson. And she wins that money basically from the lady who says, I'll just pay you, just get out of sight, you're a disgrace, and offers a crown a week, which today would be about $26 a week. Pretty good money at the time. And mom goes, wow, this is a fantastic idea. So as Mark grows up, mom continues to raise her as a boy, dresses her as a boy, calls her Mark her entire life. And she grows up as a quiet, strong, aggressive, obedient child, pawned off to do different jobs as a footman. And eventually, when she gets old enough and mom dies, decides to join the army. While in the army, she is in battle and is capable and falls in love with one of her platoon mates, buddies, one of the guys in her group, reveals herself as a woman, and the group says, good for you, we're happy for you guys. They both retire and they open up a tavern, and she thinks, there, all right, my life is finally on track. And they open the Three Horseshoe Tavern, but then her husband dies. And woe is me, she's now husbandless, and she says, I'm gonna start my life fresh and anew in the West Indies. In order to travel, what does she have to do? Dress as a man again, and she's comfortable in this, and so she boards a boat, and she's en route across the Atlantic Ocean to the West Indies. Her boat gets intercepted. That boat finds out she speaks English, and they conscript her, they force her into piracy. Now hold the story there for a second, because when she's forced to turn into piracy, it's going to overlap with my other half of my story. I switch you over to Anne Bonny. Anne Bonny is from Ireland. Her dad was a very well-to-do lawyer who has an affair with a maid and gets the maid pregnant. And the mom is absolutely mortified and says, I don't even want to look at that child. And so dad brings this new baby dressed as a boy to legitimize why there's a little kid that he totes around in the office for the next 4 or 5 years. And so Anne has no schooling and no proper education and no discipline. The maid and the dad decide that they're going to leave, and they pack everything up and they move to Charleston, South Carolina, and he becomes a plantation owner. And they bring Anne with them. The maid eventually dies. Anne becomes the mistress of the manor. She is a wild child. She is climbing trees. She is screeching and pecking out the eyes of suitors that are coming to her. She is what I would consider the ultimate badass. I'm not kidding. This woman is wacko. And she falls in love with a sailor that somehow she meets. And the sailor, John Bonny, says, I love your daughter, let's get married. And the dad says, no, you're below her class. And she goes, well, I'm doing it anyways.
Yeah.
And as soon as she does, she's disinherited. When John finds out he's not getting any money, he has no interest in Anne, but now they're hooked together and they're stuck together. So he's like, come on, we're going to the Nassau, Bahama area. And Anne's like, Dad, I can't believe you did that to me. She sets the plantation on fire as she leaves. Burns down the place, burned down her dad. When they get to the Nassau area, Anne has no interest in John anymore. And so she starts hanging out in the pubs and prostituting herself for fun. This is an absolute mar on John. He can't control his wife. He reaches out to the local governor, Woodes Rogers, and says, please publicly flog my wife for adultery. And Anne doesn't like that. And in one of the pubs, she meets her new true love of her life, Calico Jack Rackham, the pirate. She leaves her husband and becomes pregnant. He drops her off at an island, kind of alluding to your question, does she like motherhood? She has the baby. We don't ever know what happens to this child. And she has no connection to that kid and gets back on the boat with Jack and continues to pirate. Haha, took care of that problem. And they continue to pirate. As she is out pirating, their boat intercepts Mary's boat. So now you have Jack, Mary, and Anne connected together in the same boat. When they're together a couple of weeks, Anne starts to have feelings for Mark as well. Mark says, hold on, I'm Mary. Anne goes, I don't care. They become a 3-way relationship for a few weeks, and both girls end up quick with child. Now, Woodes Rogers, the former pirate governor of Jamaica, has a particular thing out for Calico Jack. He keeps evading him, and he says, I am going to get this boat. And one night, all of the pirates on the boat are drunk and asleep down below. The girls are on watch. This is the night when Calico Jack finds, when Woodes Rogers finds this boat. And the girls sound the alarm, guys, get up, they're coming, we need you. And they're too drunk to help out. The girls alone fight and battle and take down 5 or 6 of Woodes Rogers' men, but inevitably they all become arrested. They are thrown into prison. This is a statue in Nassau, Bahamas, right over here on the left of Woodes Rogers, who is considered now the hero that has cleansed the Caribbean of piracy. You can actually see that in what used to be New Providence Harbor, which is Nassau. This is a woodblock picture of him as well. And they're in prison. And in that time period, we know that Mary becomes very, very sick and she dies before she can give birth to the baby. She is never hung as a pirate, but she does pass away. Calico Jack is the next to be hung for piracy. They absolutely find him guilty. He is guilty, and he says, okay, but my one last request is I need to talk to Anne, the true love of my life. All right, we'll bring you to her cell. They're separated. And he says, Anne, I love you. Can I have one last kiss? And she looks at him and goes, No. If you had fought harder, you need not die like a dog. There's no remorse for this woman, even to the end. She is brutal to him, and he goes to the gallows brokenhearted. And we don't know what happens to this woman. Continue your research this month. I'd love to find out. Does she have the baby? Does she, with a quick tongue, work her way out of prison? We don't know. Did she escape? We don't know. Does she die in prison? We don't know. So quite a mystery to the end of that story. I bring you locally here to the idea of Hannah Screechum. Does anybody know of this woman from Osterville? 1, 2 people? Yes, you have local lore. This is kind of entwined with myth and with a little bit of history as well. Hannah Screechum is a woman that in sisterhood, there's 2 ladies, there's Hannah and Sarah. Sarah is from Mashpee at the end of her life. Hannah stays on Grand Island her whole life. And is she a witch? Is she a pirate? Is she a pirate sympathizer? There's a little bit of a mix between it. But one of the stories is that Hannah Screechum used to help pirates that would come up and down throughout the coastal area. We have a lot of pirates in New England. And her job was to protect the buried treasure. And what would occur, in particular, the story is connecting her with Captain William Kidd. Now, we know that Captain Kidd, when he was coming back from Madagascar under charges of piracy, he had been gone for 4 years, lost control of his crew, and that's a whole nother lecture. I digress. He was leaving behind enough of that money to be able to support his wife, Sarah, and his 2 daughters. And so he was making sure that they had financial stability as well as money that he could cover for his court cases. We have documentation of a receipt in an exchange from a gentleman named George Steinman in Manhattan, where Captain Kidd had left a repository. So did he also do this with Hannah? Maybe. As he comes up along the coastline, he connects with Hannah. Hannah meets the captain, a crew member on the shoreline with a lantern. And they go to a designated location. The crew member digs that hole into the sand pit, buries the treasure. And when the deed is done, Hannah pushes that crew member into the pit. He becomes buried with the sand and buried alive. In the process, Hannah is stimulated by the murder. She likes this aggressive part of it, and she screeches in enjoyment, which is also the signal to the crew out in harbor that the deed has been done. Hannah gets paid with a few trinkets and baubles and silks, and she now is the protector of this secret spot. Only the captain and Hannah know where the buried treasure is. And so this goes along with multiple captains for several years. Hannah starts to become upset that she's only getting a part of the treasure. And when she decides to go back and take some of it out, by placing that iron to the sand, she releases the spirits and they attack her and she dies. And so the lore is, for any of you that can get out over into the island, between Noisy Point and Screecham's Point, which is up here at the top, you would see her ghost walking along the coastline and you could hear her howls in the middle of the night. She's supposed to still be there, guarding the pirate treasure. Maria Cobham, grant me a few more moments. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Everybody okay? Okay, couple more ladies to go. There's just so many, and you only thought there were 2. Maria Cobham is the notorious Canadian pirate. This lady would traverse back and forth throughout the New Brunswick, PEI area, all the way down past Nantucket, back and forth and back and forth. She started life over in Plymouth, England, which is a very hot spot for a lot of merchant marines and Navy men from England. She started life as a woman of the night and in poverty. And one of her regulars was a man named Eric Cobham. And he would describe and lull to her the stories of piracy. What do you do for a job? Oh, I'm a pirate. Well, tell me about it. And he would say, you know, there's all of this money and there's this treasure and there's this adventure and we burn down the boats afterwards so nobody can trace us down. And, you know, there's all of this fighting, and it absolutely turned Mary on. Maria, and she was like, I want to be a pirate too. And he was like, all right, come with me. And so he brings her back to the vessel. Now, girls are not supposed to be on boats. They are not wanted, they're bad luck. The crew is very unhappy that the captain has done this. Somehow she wins over the crew and gains all of their respect and loyalty overnight. She becomes one of the most brutal pirates, and she is a crazy cutthroat woman. You can think of this woman as like a really aggressive serial killer lady. She's like the Blackbeard of female pirates. She will continue to fight along, and she decides that she wants to kill for fun. She really enjoys the violence of piracy in particular. She will put prisoners up against the mast of the boat and shoot them for target practice. One time she sews a prisoner into a bag and throws him overboard just to see what happens. So she's quite a ruthless woman. She continues to pirate for a while and until they attacked a boat called the Alberta, which is right off of Nantucket. And her husband says, we need to stop, we're gonna get caught. She goes, well, I will only stop if you buy me a castle in France. And the Alberta boat is probably lucrative enough where this can happen. This is gonna be their last haul. In celebration of that, this is the last time, Maria serves dinner to the entire crew. And they're like, this is kind of out of character, but if this is the way we're going out, okay, we understand. The next morning, everybody's dead from food poisoning. They move to Le Havre, France, and they end up purchasing an area where they're right on the coast, on the cliffs, and they can look out to sea. The husband, Eric, becomes a magistrate in the area. They have kids, but Maria still looks out to sea quite often. And after a couple of years, they become more and more rich somehow. And Eric realizes, you know, she's doing something on the sly, and then she dies mysteriously. And she's jumped from the cliff from boredom because she can't be a pirate anymore? Or did Eric gently bump off his wife so that he doesn't have that reputation messing up his new change in life? We don't know what happens quite exactly.
She was only 20?
Only 20. Wild woman. Rachel Wall, an actual woman, she was from Philadelphia and she moved to Boston. She married a gentleman named George Wall, and she was a maid and he was a fisherman. They were both very heavy drinkers, like true pirates should be. And they were really bad with money, and they would always make ends just barely meet. And one day when they are totally drunk, the boat takes off and leaves George. And they said, this is it, you know, we're going without you. In order to make ends meet, they steal a friend's boat and they set up their operation off of the Isle of Shoals, right on the New Hampshire border. And what they decide to do is play pirate. And they do it in a different version where Rachel plays into that gender stereotype. She is a pirate that plays on the idea of being a pretty pirate. She's a siren. And so they only pirate when there are storms. They make the boat look as though it's under duress, and Rachel goes up onto the dock and waves down to the other men with her pretty face, help, help, help. You know, there's been a storm and I need you. And when these vessels approach, the guys surge up from below and attack. They kill everybody and they leave the boat in shambles because dead men tell no tales. And they get away with this for several encounters until during one of these horrible wicked storms, George actually dies and Maria has to flag down the boat for real, and she gets rescued. They bring her back to Boston. She has to go back to being a maid. She's not happy about it. She steals from her employer and she gets arrested. And in her court proceedings and documentation, she is absolutely miffed that she is going to be hung in the gallows for stealing and not for piracy. She is the last woman hung in the state of Massachusetts.
Wow.
And I leave you with the coolest, most, dare I say, badass woman there is. Madam Ching, Madam Ching is the most famous, most successful, most lucrative pirate that ever existed, male or female. You don't hear about this woman because again, history was written by men. Madam Ching was phenomenal, and if you look at the dates, she wasn't that long ago. She was from Canton, China, and she started off life in absolute poverty in China. She was a prostitute on the flower boats. These are vessels that would be traversing throughout the harbor area, delivering food, delivering goods, prostitution, opium, song, things like that. She encounters Qing Yi and they fall in love, and he is the leader of the pirates. And during this time period, mainland China is absolutely creating a huge class difference between the imperial world and everybody else. And to bring any of the raw material and goods into mainland China, it has to go through the ports and the harbors and the rivers. The only way these local people feel as though they can make an impact is if they start to blockade these locations and create an imputed tax. So they're stopping anything, you have to pay them before they'll let it pass through. And the pirates are gaining in popularity. People are flooding from the land onto vessels. They're bringing their children and their dogs and everything. And it becomes these floating cities out in the water, land away from land. Qing Yi is in charge of all of this. And in China, at the time, very forward thinking, men and women held the same position. And when Qing Yi dies, Madam Chang takes over his position as the leader of the pirates, undisputed, contested, thank you, uncontested for that position. So they respect her straight away. And what she does is absolutely mind-blowing with this ability. She will amass in her career 70,000 sailors.
Wow.
She will have over 1,000 junks, large sailing vessels. She will have over 700 smaller vessels as part of her fleet, in addition to that floating land territory. She is the one that is responsible for writing the Brethren Code. And so what you recognize as the rules and regulations of how to operate this mini world, who can marry, who can't marry, if something happens, what is your jail time? Governance is created by Madam Chang. She also, in mafioso style, starts to amass all of these collected items in a warehouse and logs them in a journal. And so she has documentation of how many goods are coming in so that everybody can get their fair share. She retitles things. They are not pillaging, they are moving and doing transgooding. But she is a force of her own. She has so many fleets that she names them by color and starts to manipulate them throughout the Indian Ocean. And the Imperial Army is so afeared of this woman and it's messing things up that the Chinese actually pair up with their mortal enemies, the Dutch and the Spanish and the French at this time. And they say, just for these few battles, can we work together against the pirate? They lose. And she takes over those fleets. Wow. This woman is unstoppable. And as her career continues, inevitably, she is taken down by her son-in-law on the Black Fleet, and he disobeys her. And she can sort of see the end is coming, and she says, all right, I'm going out on my own terms. And so she decides that she's going to cessate piracy. And so she's going to approach the king and say, here are my terms. And they're ready for it. Okay, the pirate queen, this pirate, evil woman is coming. Everybody show up in your full garb, swords sharpened, army outfit, and they line from the shoreline to the imperial palace so she can't escape. Both sides of the road, every cannon that they have. Madam Ching absolutely shows up and nails them back. In her silken robes, tiny mincing feet, unarmed, surrounded by children. Yeah. And she humiliates them and takes her mincing steps the entire way to the palace so that everybody has full view of this delicate woman. And when she arrives, she is the queen of negotiation. They are so scared of this woman, she gets everything she wants. And she says, I want every single one of my people to be pardoned. Nobody is going to jail. They will all have food for a year. They will all be given government jobs. They will all be allowed to keep everything that they have pillaged. They will all be given land to set up households wherever they are. And then she says, I would like to move back to Canton and live happily ever after. So it does happen sometimes. She dies at the age of 68, just by a woman. So in conclusion, why would a woman want to become a pirate? Why do this? It's beyond just dressing as a man and role playing. You're trying to escape horrible marriages at the time, this confinement, this restriction. You're being forced into these conditions and you want to be your own self. You want a different life. If you are found pregnant, you want to avoid time in a convent. You don't want to go to jail, poverty, or prostitution. There is the lure of riches and adventure, seeking revenge on others, of course. But really the take-home message is that piracy has that ability to allow you to control your own fate. Women want to be able to be that amazing powerhouse that they are without restrictions. So I appreciate your time here. I will open up for questions if anybody wants to.